Hello, Shoyan here. Today, I'm building a straight staircase. I'll be installing it in this space with the top step serving as a landing. This means there are only 13 treads, which is one fewer than usual. Let's get started. As always, I'm using pine for the staircase. When I started my Japanese channel, my first project was a staircase made of laminated hinoki boards. At the time though, we only uploaded videos of a flower box and a short deck called Nure-en, not the staircase. If we had filmed it back then, the video would have featured other types of wood, not just pine. As it is, every staircase I've shown so far has been made of pine. To begin building a staircase, I measure and rough cut the pine. Pine tends to warp easily when exposed to sunlight and wind. However, it's also very flexible, and when planed, it gives off a beautiful sheen thanks to its resin. It's truly one of Japan's finest materials and, in my opinion, the best wood for staircases. These days, pre-cut building materials are common and they don't warp, but they also lack the natural sheen and character of solid wood. Pine is the official tree of my home prefecture, Fukui. Truly wonderful wood. For whiteboards like these, a super surfacer makes finishing easier. Until recently, I used a small super surfacer that was almost like a toy, but last year it finally broke down. The belt snapped, so I urgently searched online for a replacement. Second-hand tools are surprisingly easy to find if you're willing to pick them up in person. I found this one with an auto-return feature which feeds the timber back while planing it. A new machine costs about 1.5 million yen, but I got this second-hand for 70,000 yen. It works perfectly, more than enough for the job. After running the timber through the jointer, planer, and super surfacer, I bring it to the site. Once on site, I immediately cut the grooves for the treads and risers and finish them neatly. I will leave them for 2 to 3 days, during which time the timber tends to warp, making hand planing nearly impossible. Forcing a warped board through a hand plane makes the thickness uneven, so I make sure to finish everything before warping can occur. Until they're needed, I carefully store and protect the boards. Delaying this step only makes it harder to finish later. When finishing the boards, I plane the front edge perfectly square. For the back, where the riser fits, I plane it at a slight angle. This ensures a snug, secure fit when driving in the screws. Now, the timber gets a cozy nap for 2 days. This is a straightforward straight staircase, but it doesn't reach the second floor. Instead, it has a landing one step below the second floor level. I think it'd be fine to take it all the way to the top. On the right side of the landing is a second floor hallway, while to the left is the entrance to a closet. This layout allows access to the second floor from both sides of the landing, a design I haven't tried before. It's a bit unusual, but not bad. It's a common straight staircase, but with fewer steps. When building staircases with landings or winders, I always finish the landing or winder first. This helps to determine the accurate length for the straight stairs. Here, I start by completing the top landing. After that, I mark the position of the staircase at the installation site. I installed an exposed sill called kamachi along the edge when building the second floor. I will also add a kamachi made from pine and matching the step size on the front of the landing. The landing floor uses the same flooring as the second floor. With the landing complete, I mark the stringers. Though calculations can give a rough idea, I always measure the site to ensure accuracy. It's often said that building a staircase defines a true carpenter. But marking out stairs is really just division. No addition, subtraction, or multiplication needed. You simply divide the total rise and run by the number of steps and mark their positions. A calculator is all you need. Now that I've finished marking two stringers, I move on to cutting them. Before cutting, I first take rough measurements of the slope. Since the position of the top landing is already set, I measure the length from the bottom to the top kamachi of the landing to determine the placement of the first step. Then, I compare this measurement with the marked stringer. There's sometimes a 2 to 3 millimeter difference, but anything within 3 millimeters is acceptable. After confirming the measurements, I cut the top and bottom of the stringer and test fit them. If you cut all the grooves without testing and they don't fit, all the materials and effort would go to waste. Once I'm confident in the fit at the top and bottom, I cut the grooves for the treads. I take my time with this step because careful work here saves a lot of trouble later. Now I start cutting the stringers. When cutting the grooves for the treads and risers, I first score the outline of each groove with a utility knife. This prevents the grain from tearing when I'm cutting against it with a groove cutter. Scoring it first keeps the wood clean. I'll admit that I often take a shortcut and cut freehand. Using an adjustable angle square while stepping on it and cutting can be hard on the body. Even setting up a guide ruler for each groove takes extra time. As long as I trust my hands, freehand cutting is much faster. I'm taking a shortcut like this, but some carpenters working with pre-cut materials skip scoring. They use a guide ruler and make a single clean pass with a fine-toothed circular saw. For me, that's too nerve-wracking, so I prefer finishing with a chisel instead. For straight staircases, whether they have 3 steps or 13, the process for the stringers is basically the same. Of course, you need to cut 10 more grooves than 3, but the only difference is the number of grooves to cut. The real challenge comes with fan-shaped winders or open stairs. Compared to those, straight staircases are much simpler and more satisfying to build. When cutting the grooves, I make them about 2 mm narrower than the treads to ensure a tight fit. If the grooves are the exact size of the treads, they'll feel loose. But if they're too tight, the corners of the treads might chip or leave marks, ruining the finish. 2 mm narrower is just right, and I stick to that measurement. Now I've finished cutting the stringers. They feel a little shorter than usual since there's 1 step less. At the start, I ran the stringers through the super surfacer for a clean finish. However, they can't be used right after cutting. They still need some touch-ups. Even if they end up 3 mm thinner, it doesn't matter. What's important is that the stringers are perfectly straight, no matter how rough or warped they were initially. Next, I secure the stringers. If the studs or columns are warped, it can be tricky to align them so they're straight. I've designed the first riser to be installed from the back, so I firmly secure the stringers first. At this point, I wake up the children. In Japanese, treads are called danita or fumiita, but in the past they were called koita, child boards. Stringers, on the other hand, are oyaita, parent boards. It's like a parent and children, just a bit of trivia. I make sure to number the children. With the stringers firmly in place, I use a straight edge to measure the length of each tread. Even with 13 steps, the lengths aren't perfectly uniform. To adjust them, I trim the top or bottom 3 treads slightly shorter according to each condition of the sides. Now I've finished cutting the threads. Once they're properly cut to size, I move on to adding an anti-slip groove. To do this, I use a round blade to create a single groove. Since the grooves are made 2 mm narrower, I hammer the edges of the threads to compress the wood for a snug fit. Technically, a 3 to 4 mm smaller groove will still work, but hammering too much crushes the wood fibers and damages the material. The sweet spot is about 1.5 to 2 mm smaller, and I stick to 2 mm. Previously, I used to install the first thread and riser at the beginning. Now, by notching the back of the stringer diagonally, I can install the thread from the back instead. This method works just fine without compromising strength. Now, I start inserting the threads. Even with a 2 to 3 mm tighter fit, getting them in perfectly is no small task. I usually hammer each thread about 20 times to fit them snugly. It's challenging to adjust it to the perfect fit. Even when tightly installed, threads will naturally loosen over time, so I make sure to secure them firmly with screws. Next, I apply water to the edges where I hammered to compress the wood. After letting it sit for 2 or 3 minutes, I wipe down the entire thread. Skipping this step would affect the wood's sheen. The compressed fibers swell up quickly with water, restoring their original look. Then, I fine-tune the fit between the risers and threads. Honestly, this is my least favorite part of building a staircase. The riser's vertical line and the thread's back edge often don't align perfectly. Adjusting this is tricky because there's not much room to work with a chisel between the threads. Still, I find a way to make the risers fit properly. I begin by installing the first riser. I've dry run earlier with protective boards to ensure a neat fit. The riser is in place, but securing it is another challenge. Ideally, the floorboard should be cut where it meets the riser so it can be installed from behind. However, there's a 15 mm floorboard installed above a subfloor, so that's not possible. The first riser is always the most troublesome. The only way to attach it is by gluing and nailing a thin piece of wood. This might be the first time I've driven nails directly on this side in months. Once the riser is in place, I glue around the screws to prevent splitting. The ends of the board are prone to cracking from screw holes. To avoid this, I apply glue about 1 to 2 centimeters along the edges. I also glue at the center of the grain. Wood naturally splits along the grain, so gluing here effectively prevents cracks in the risers. Now, the staircase is complete. It's a standard straight pine staircase. In this house, the landing allows access in 2 directions. A slightly unusual design. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.